Sanjay, these days we live in a world of nation states, and our cartographical maps are divided up into national territories. And if we were looking at what's now represented by India, say 500 years or so ago, and we were wanting to include the kinds of things that we associate with nations, states, aspects of shared culture, shared history, shared political experience and so on, how might we divide up that area these days, at that time?
At that time. I mean, the obvious place to start, and it's the topical place to start if you think about it, is, of course, you would want to think about South India, for instance, very closely in relation to Sri Lanka, right? Because, actually in the 17th century, you even had a South Indian dynasty ruling over Kandy for a certain time. They were Telugu speakers. So in fact, you have enormous amounts of sort of circulation between South India and Sri Lanka as a long historical process. And of course, it's one of the things that, eventually politically, after 1950, Sri Lankans are often in denial about, because they want to make out that, for instance, these connections were relatively recent, brought about by the colonial powers and so on. Whereas in fact, Tamils have been going to Sri Lanka, and people have been coming from Sri Lanka to South India for the longest time, and certainly that would be one sort of sphere of circulation that you would want to see.
And in fact, that would go out into what's now Malaysia, and even as far as Indonesia in the Middle Ages.
That's right, because once you start thinking about it, Sri Lanka, for instance, has a very interesting and important connections with Thailand, India with Java and Sumatra, northern Sumatra, and to come from Aceh to southern India, it's barely a week or 10 days sailing. So these are really incredibly close places, which today we think of somehow as separate, because that's supposed to be Southeast Asia, and this is supposed to be South Asia. But
they were tied up then. And if we were looking at other similar kinds of connections, I mean, from the southwest coast to Arabia, that would also be another set of connections.
Yes, I mean, this is again something which we know about, but we don't think about very much. And in India, people are often uncomfortable when you tell them, say, that there were African dynasties in ruling over parts of India, right? For people coming from the Swahili coast and so on. I mean, in the 17th century, there were these Maliks, for example, in Ahmednagar. There was actually even an Ethiopian dynasty which ruled for about 15 years in Bengal in the late 15th century. We tend to forget that, of course, this was partly an elite slave traffic, and that's also perhaps something which has been obscured, which is there was a slave trade in the Indian Ocean which was considerably more important than people today make it out to be. It was perhaps not in the dimensions of the Atlantic one, but that was also kind of a sphere of circulation.
Yes, and again, I'm thinking about what people in India today would be surprised about, would be those very close links between Gujarat, which is now perhaps one of the centres of Hindu nationalism, and Central Asia and West Asia, and particularly Arabia. I mean, a lot of Gujarati words actually come from the Arabic.
You probably know the very important and quite brilliant in many ways book by Eng Seng Ho, called The Graves of Tarim, where he actually talks about these people coming out of Yemen and the Hadramaut, and who are actually really quite important at various levels, both sort of in religious terms and otherwise in Gujarat. And then eventually from Gujarat into Southeast Asia. So you get these same people. One of the most important figures in 17th century Aceh from a religious point of view is a guy called Nuruddin Raniri, who comes from Randed, which is the other side of the river from Surat, but actually the family comes from the Hadramaut. And so you get a sort of a very complex articulation, and which actually continues into the 19th century. These people will then go into Singapore, they will then go into Malaysia, and so on.
And we should forget that this does carry on through the 19th century. I mean, there's so much more concern then with connections with Europe, but in fact, in many ways, that Indian Ocean world lives on.
Yes. Actually, my colleague Niall Green is doing some quite interesting work on this stuff, looking at the Western Indian Ocean as a zone of circulation in the 19th century, focusing actually on Bombay, and he actually shows how Bombay is very closely tied up to the Persian Gulf, but then also to Islam in South Africa, for instance. And so there's a whole story to be told there. But getting back to, say, 500 years ago, yes, you could actually imagine sort of several cartographies, right? So you could get the one we've been talking about with regard to the Western Indian Ocean. You would have the one linking South India and so on. But I mean, for example, Bengal and Burma were actually incredibly close and very, very, interestingly tied up in many ways. And that is an absolutely artificial divide to imagine that we somehow, hive Burma off and push it off into some other category, and then we think of Bengal as being linked solely to northern India and so on.
That was really a function of colonialism, and
yes.
particularly the East India Company.
Yes, yes. Because actually, if you look to, there's some very interesting recent work on northern Burma, and you get these sort of Burmese rulers there, but heavily Persianized, and drawing on materials from northern India and from beyond, and actually, often thought of as a very sort of peripheral part of the world, but in fact, very important in many, many ways, very crucially. As Jervis was saying, Clarence Smith was saying yesterday, Yunnan may be a backwater from the point of view of Chinese official in Beijing, but it was quite central in its own terms.
Yes. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the Persianized world, in some ways, the greatest connections between that space in the Indian subcontinent and outside was northwards, northwestwards, particularly.
Yes. So that would actually take you from northern India, into Afghanistan and Central Asia. I remember not so long ago, they had imported an Uzbek coach for one of the Delhi football teams, and this man actually said, you people don't seem to realize how close this stuff really is. Uzbekistan is very close to northern India, and somehow we don't, again, as a function of first the rivalries between the Russian and the British empires, and then eventually the Soviet Union and so on, it's sort of become in our imagination quite far, but obviously, logically, that's where the Mughals came from, after all.
And a lot of North Indian culture remains always oriented in that direction.
Yes, absolutely. For example, if today I hear, Uzbek or Tajik music, it's so, remarkably close to a lot of Northern Indian music. The sarod and, some of the lute-type instruments that you find over there. The maqams there are very close to the rags of Northern India.
So, if going back to my original question, we were trying to draw a map of all this.
Yes.
Some years ago, Kirti Chowdhury drew one which sort of divided the subcontinent up into three kinds of circuits, he called them, of trade and civilization. You would think that was a fair way to represent cartographic space if we were trying to do so.
Yes, but I think that, in fact, part of the problem is that these are shifting circuits, and so one can't sort of imagine that they remain stable for centuries on end. There are going to be clear moments when the orientation is going to change, and you will get much stronger connections, for example, between South India and Southeast Asia at a certain moment, and then I think turning away at another moment, and so on. China, for example, is not very present in the Indian imagination in the 16th or the 17th century, but it was in the 6th or the 7th century.
And in the end, coming back to, is there anything sort of distinctive about India? Could one say that it is, because it is that point of junction, this is one part of the world, if you like, where peoples from far to the east, far to the north, far to the west, come together and constitute some kind of society together?
Yes, but then it's not really India which you're thinking of, because I would certainly then want to include Sri Lanka in it. In that same process, say much more than the Andamans, which are today a part of the Indian national territory, but which are actually quite isolated from these processes for a long time. So you would actually have to think this as yes, it's a kind of there's a kind of logical peninsular dead end aspect to it. So you can't really push beyond this in terms of the movements of population unless you are actually talking about maritime migrations. But there's clearly a sense in which yes, it's. My friend, the late Denis Lombard, used to talk about what he talked about as the Carrefour Javanais, which is to say Java is a crossroads. And I think that there's no reason why we shouldn't think of India as a sort of crossroads as well. But of course, Indian nationalism feels uncomfortable with that.
Yes. Thank you very much for joining me today, Sanjay.
Well, thank you, David.